In the hidden world of organized crime, where trust is more valuable than money and betrayal can get you killed, there was one man who stood above the violent chaos. His name commanded respect across entire countries. Vito Rizzuto, known as Montreal's Teflon Dome, built a criminal empire so advanced, so widespread, that it connected the cold streets of Canada to the bloody meeting rooms of New York's most powerful Mafia families. His story is not about wild shootouts or showy brutality. Instead, it is a lesson in patience, smart thinking, and old-fashioned rules of honor brought into the modern criminal world. Before we dive into this amazing true story, I want to know where you are watching from. Type your city and the time in the comments down below. Are you watching this late at night, like I am? And if you are ready to learn about one of the most powerful gangsters you have probably never heard of, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is going to be an incredible journey. Hit the like button if you are already interested, and share this video with anyone who loves real Mafia stories. This is the story of a man who watched his empire get built over many years, only to see it fall apart in just a few. A tale of power gained through brains instead of brawn. Of revenge taken coldly after many years in prison. And of a dynasty that started in the dirt of Sicily and grew to control an entire Canadian city. It is a story with no good guys, where every win is only temporary and every throne is stained with blood. What you are about to hear is not some made-up gangster movie. It is the true story of the rise and fall of one of North America's most powerful and least known crime bosses. A man who followed ancient rules in a modern world, who chose talking over fighting until fighting became the only option, and who ended up paying for his empire with the lives of the people he loved the most. Let's go back to the very beginning. February 21st, 1946. A tiny Sicilian village called Cattolica Ericlaya sat on the southwestern coast of Sicily. It was a place where the Mediterranean breeze carried both the smell of salt water and whispered secrets. In this ancient land, where old Roman ruins dotted the hills and traditions went back thousands of years, Vito Rizzuto came into a world that would shape every single choice he would ever make. Right after World War II, Sicily was a place full of opposites. The war had just finished, leaving the island's economy completely wrecked. Yet the way people lived was still ruled by codes older than any modern fight. Poverty was everywhere. Good jobs were impossible to find. And for most families, the only way forward meant getting involved with the one power system that had survived hundreds of years of foreign rule. The Sicilian Mafia. The Rizzuto name already meant something in this world. Vito's father, Niccolo Rizzuto, was a man connected to the complicated web of Sicilian organized crime, even though at this time his position was not very high. The family lived by ancient Sicilian traditions where honor, family loyalty, and omerta, the sacred rule of silence, controlled everything. These were not just ideas or romantic thoughts. They were the real rules for staying alive every single day. Young Vito grew up in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. But some things were never talked about. The village worked on understandings that were never spoken out loud. A man's word was his bond, supported not by written papers, but by the certainty of violent punishment if you betrayed someone. Kids learned early to watch carefully, talk very little, and understand that loyalty to family came before everything else. The Rizzuto household was traditional in every way. Vito's mom took care of the home while his dad handled business. Some of it was legal, some of it definitely was not. The family went to church regularly, took part in village parties, and kept up the appearance of being respectable, which was very important in Sicilian society. But behind this normal front, Young Vito was getting an education that no school could ever give him. He learned how to read people, to understand the tiny power plays that ruled how adults interacted, to figure out who really had the power and who was just pretending. He watched his dad move through the complicated social levels of village life, seeing how respect was earned through a mix of reputation, skill, and smart friendships. These lessons would turn out to be priceless many years later, thousands of miles away. Sicily in the 1950s did not have many chances to move up in life. The island's economy was still terrible. Farming work barely kept people alive, and the younger generation kept looking toward faraway shores for families tied to organized crime. Staying in Sicily meant working in a place that was way too crowded, where fights over territory were settled with sawed-off shotguns, and where the police, even if they were often on the take, were at least actually present. In 1954, when Vito was 8 years old, the Rizzuto family made a choice that would change the path of organized crime in North America. Niccolo Rizzuto, seeing that there was no future in Sicily and noticing chances abroad, set up the family to move to Canada. The trip across the ocean was more than just moving to a new place. It was a smart business decision dressed up as a family relocation. The Rizzutos were not the only ones leaving. During the 1950s, thousands of Sicilians and southern Italians ran away from the poverty after the war to find chances in North America. Canada's immigration rules back then were pretty open, especially for people from Europe, and Montreal's growing Italian community gave new arrivals a ready-made group of people to help them settle in. The boat trip itself was terrible. Traveling by ship, the family spent days in crowded spaces. Young Vito got his first taste of life away from Sicily's familiar coasts. His mother, Libertina, was surely worried about the unknown future waiting for them. His dad, though, already had contacts in Montreal. Guys from Sicilian villages who had made the trip years earlier and had gotten themselves settled in the city's growing Italian community. When the Rizzuto family got to Montreal in 1954, they walked into a city that was changing fast. Canada after the war was seeing economic growth and cities were spreading out. Montreal, as Canada's biggest city and main economic center, was booming. The port was buzzing with business activity. Building sites were everywhere, and different ethnic neighborhoods were creating their own identities within the city. The family settled into Montreal's growing Italian community, mostly in neighborhoods like Villeray and parts of what would become known as Little Italy. Here, Sicilian and Calabrian immigrants recreated pieces of their homeland. Social clubs, coffee shops, small stores, and religious groups that kept cultural ties alive while helping them fit into Canadian society. For young Vito, Canada meant both new chances and staying connected to the old ways. The Rizzuto family kept Sicilian traditions inside their home, speaking Italian, cooking traditional food, following old country customs. At the same time, Vito went to Canadian schools, learned English and French, and soaked up the cultural rules of his new country. This double identity, deeply Sicilian, but also completely Canadian, would become one of his biggest strengths in the years ahead. Niccolo Rizzuto quickly connected with Montreal's existing crime networks. The city's underworld in the 1950s was mostly run by the Cotroni family, Calabrians who had taken control of gambling, prostitution, and sneaking into labor unions. The Cotronis, led by Vincenzo Vic Cotroni, had ties to New York's Bonanno crime family and controlled a lot of Montreal's very profitable illegal businesses. Niccolo, as a Sicilian in a world run by Calabrians, started at the very bottom of the criminal ladder. He took whatever work was available, collecting debts. running small betting operations, doing minor smuggling. The Sicilian Code of Omerta meant he never complained, never brought attention to himself, and slowly built a name for being reliable and discreet. These traits would be passed down to his son. Vito Rizzuto's childhood years in Montreal gave him an education that no regular school could offer. While he went to school and learned normal subjects, his real lessons happened in the social clubs, coffee shops, and back rooms of Little Italy, where his dad did business. The Montreal underworld in the 1960s worked with almost no fear of getting caught. City government corruption was everywhere, with cops and politicians on the payroll of organized crime. The city's illegal businesses, gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, made huge amounts of money, while the new drug trade promised to make even more. The Cotroni organization ran this empire with brutal effectiveness, and Niccolo Rizzuto worked inside this system while quietly building his own group of people he could trust. Young Vito learned by watching. He saw how his dad kept up relationships, treating everyone with respect no matter their status, keeping his promises, avoiding fights that were not necessary. He watched how arguments were settled through middlemen instead of direct fighting, how business partnerships were set up to make sure both sides gained something, how information was just as valuable as money. The legal businesses Niccolo set up, a coffee shop, getting into construction, served many purposes. They gave him legal money to explain why the family was doing better financially. They offered meeting places for business talks, and they provided cover for illegal activities. Vito learned that successful organized crime needed these layers of being legal, that the best criminals kept up a good public image while doing their legal business in the shadows. In 1966, at age 20, Vito's spot within Montreal's Sicilian community was made stronger through marriage. He wed Giovanna Camilleri, whose family had their own ties inside the Italian underworld. This was not just about love, even though people say the marriage was stable, but it was a smart alliance that tied families together through blood and shared interests. Throughout the late 1960s, Vito kept learning the ropes of organized crime. This time period saw huge changes in how the underworld did business. The old ways of making money, gambling, prostitution, loan sharking were still profitable. But the drug trade was becoming the main event. Heroin, mostly coming from Sicilian suppliers and moved through the French connection routes, was making money like never before. The Cotroni organization controlled a lot of this trafficking, with Montreal acting as a key stopping point between European suppliers and American markets. Vito's job grew slowly. He moved from collecting small debts to more important jobs, organizing shipments, running distribution networks, handling money. His brains became obvious to the leaders of the organization. Unlike a lot of young gangsters who tried to get noticed through violence or by showing off their money, Vito worked quietly, smoothly, and profitably. He dressed nicely, but not too flashy, lived comfortably, but not showing off, and built a name for calmly solving problems instead of losing his temper. The 1970s brought both chances and stress to Montreal's organized crime scene. The Cotroni family's control was still strong, but things were shifting behind the scenes. The Sicilian group, led by Niccolo Rizzuto, was getting more powerful, running businesses that made more and more money while still acting like they accepted the Calabrian leadership. This created a shaky balance. The Cotronis had the traditional power, but the Rizzutos controlled the resources that were growing. Vito moved through this world with his usual smart approach. He kept up respectful ties with the Cotroni organization while building loyalty among his fellow Sicilians. He understood that directly fighting them would backfire. Instead, he focused on making himself and his group essential to the organization's most profitable operations. Taking control of drug smuggling networks, especially the heroin pipelines from Sicily, gave the Rizzuto's power that would eventually turn into control. By the late 1970s, Vito had become a name that was getting noticed in Montreal's underworld. He was known for several key qualities: brains that were as good as or better than anyone his age, a calm attitude that never showed emotion during negotiations or fights, diplomatic skills that settled arguments without violence, and complete silence about all business matters. These traits caught the attention not just of local criminals, but of much more powerful groups to the south. The connection between Montreal's organized crime and New York's five families had been around since the early 1900s. The Bonanno crime family, one of New York's five mafia groups, had especially strong ties to Montreal, seeing the Canadian city as both a profitable market and a smart place for operations that were too risky to do on American soil. By the late 1970s, the Bonanno family was having problems inside. Carmine Galante, a powerful captain, had been making aggressive moves to take over the family and grow into drug operations. His ambition and his disrespect for the usual mafia rules made him enemies in many families. On July 12, 1979, Galante was murdered in a very public way at Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant in Brooklyn. He was shot dead with a cigar still in his mouth, in a hit that became one of organized crime's most famous moments. Galante's murder left a power gap and made existing tensions inside the Bonanno family even worse. The new leaders, mostly organized around Captain Joseph Massino, worked to take control, but three captains were causing problems for this takeover: Philip Philly Lucky Giacconi, Dominic Big Tring Trinchera, and Alphonse Sonny Red Indelicato. These men had their own loyal crews, and they questioned Massino's authority. Massino knew that getting rid of these three captains would need careful planning. Using Bonanno family soldiers for the hits could start a full-scale war inside the family, since loyal followers might fight back. What Massino needed was outside shooters, skilled, trustworthy men who could do the job and then disappear back over the border before anyone could connect them to the crime. He turned to Montreal, specifically to the Rizzuto organization. The request came through the usual channels. Vito Rizzuto, by 1981, had built a strong reputation inside Bonanno circles. He was known as smart, discreet, and capable. When he was asked about taking part in the hit, Vito understood what it meant. Agreeing meant becoming a made man in the Bonanno family, getting official recognition inside one of America's most powerful crime groups. Saying no meant insulting powerful friends and possibly putting the Rizzuto family's profitable relationship with New York in danger. Vito accepted the job. The social club at 2020 86th Street in Brooklyn looked completely normal from the outside. Just another storefront in a working-class neighborhood. Inside, though, it was neutral ground for Bonanno family business. On May 5, 1981, the three captains, Giacconi, Trinchera, and Indelicato, were told they were coming to a meeting to settle disagreements in the organization. They showed up thinking this was a peace talk. They were walking into an execution. Vito Rizzuto and another Canadian associate had arrived earlier. Hiding in a closet in a back room of the social club, the setup was carefully planned. Massino's crew would greet the three captains, make small talk with them, then give the signal when the time was right. Vito and his partner would come out, along with other chosen shooters, and kill the targets before they could fight back or run away. The captains showed up separately during the afternoon. As each one walked into the club, They were sent to the back room where the supposed meeting would happen. The mood was polite, businesslike. Exactly what you would expect from a work talk among high-ranking mobsters. Then the signal came. Several masked gunmen came out at the same time. The three captains realized it was a trap, but had no time to do anything. The shooting was quick, professional, and completely ruthless. Jacone, Trinchera, and Indelicato were cut down in seconds, their bodies falling to the floor as gun smoke filled the small space. The murders were done like a professional job. No hesitation, no witnesses left alive who could testify, no evidence left behind that could definitely tie the killers to the crime. Vito and his Canadian friend disappeared immediately, crossing back into Canada before the police had even figured out who the dead men were. For the Bonanno family, the hit did what it was supposed to do. It got rid of the people opposing Massino's leadership. For Vito Rizzuto, it meant something even bigger. It proved his abilities to America's most powerful criminal groups. The three captains' murder would later be shown, not completely accurately, in the movie Donnie Brasco, which told the story of FBI agent Joseph Pistone's time inside the Bonanno family. The movie showed the hits as part of the inside fighting he saw, even though the movie's version made the real story simpler and did not identify Vito's involvement for years. Vito's part in it stayed unknown to law enforcement. The hit was clean. Witnesses either stayed quiet or were killed. And crime scene evidence from 1981 was pretty basic. Vito went back to Montreal with his reputation way better than before. He was now a made member of the Bonanno family, with all the respect and protection that came with it. The Rizzuto organization's connection with New York was stronger than ever, opening doors for more profitable teamwork. But the murders planted seeds that would eventually destroy Vito's empire. In organized crime, there are always witnesses, even when criminals think there aren't any. Associates watch, they remember, and sometimes, when they are facing their own legal trouble many years later, they talk. The perfect crime in 1981 would become the perfect evidence in 2004. Through the 1980s, the Rizzuto family systematically took apart the Cotroni organization's control over Montreal's underworld. This was not done through a big war, even though there was some violence, but through better business sense, stronger international connections, and smart alliances that left the Cotronis without their power base. Niccolo Rizzuto and his son Vito worked together, each using their own strengths. Niccolo, the old-school Sicilian, kept ties to the traditional power players and commanded respect from the older mobsters. Vito, more modern and flexible, built relationships with newer criminal groups, motorcycle gangs, street crews, and white-collar professionals who could help with laundering money and bribing people in legal industries. The Cotroni family's weakness was that they did not change with the times. They stayed focused on their old rackets: gambling, loan sharking, union corruption. While the drug trade was making way more money, the Rizzutos, with their direct connections to Sicilian suppliers and American distributors, took over this growing market. Money from drugs let them move into legal businesses, buy protection from crooked officials, and offer better deals to criminal associates who might have stayed loyal to the Cotronis. By the mid-1980s, the balance had clearly shifted. The Rizzutos controlled Montreal's port, which was crucial for bringing in drugs from Europe, through a mix of union members they had gotten to, officials they had bribed, and smart partnerships with legal businesses. They dominated construction industry rackets all over Quebec, using threats and cheating on bids to get contracts and take kickbacks. Their money laundering networks spread across continents. moving cash through legal businesses, bank accounts in other countries, and complicated financial tricks that hid where the money really came from. The Cotrones, even though people still respected them, had been pushed down to minor players in an empire they once ran. Some former Cotrone associates switched sides. Seeing where the real power now was, others retired, taking whatever money the Rizzutos offered. A few fought back and then disappeared, not in a big showy way, not in hits that made the news, but quietly. Their bodies were never found, or their deaths were made to look like accidents. The big moment came in 1996, when Vito did something that had never been done before in Montreal's criminal history. He united almost all organized crime under one single system. This was not a formal merger. The different groups kept their own independence on paper, but it was a smart setup where major criminal activities in Montreal needed Rizzuto approval and paid money to the Rizzuto organization. Street gangs selling drugs in certain neighborhoods, motorcycle clubs running prostitution and drug networks, traditional Italian mobsters running gambling, even new ethnic criminal groups from Haiti, Lebanon, or Eastern Europe all operated with Rizzuto's busing and under Rizzuto's watch. Anyone who refused to play along found themselves cut off, their operations messed with, their members arrested through tips to the police, or worse. This unity brought profits like never before and less violence. Instead of different groups fighting over territory and business, the Rizzuto organization set clear rules, settled arguments, and made sure that police attention stayed manageable. Montreal became one of North America's most profitable criminal markets, making billions of dollars while having less violence than many American cities. Vito's personal style was a big part of this success. Unlike flashy American mobsters, who wore expensive jewelry, drove cars that got attention, and tried to be celebrities, Vito kept a low profile. He dressed in nice but not flashy suits, lived in a nice but not giant home in the Cartierville neighborhood, and stayed away from nightclubs or restaurants where he might be photographed or seen. People who met Vito described a calm, soft-spoken man who listened more than he talked, who never raised his voice when angry, and who acted more like a company CEO than a gangster. This way of acting was both natural and planned. It let him move through normal society without getting noticed, while showing an image of being reasonable and in control to both friends and enemies. Behind this civilized mask, though, there was a brutal criminal organization at work. The Rizzuto Empire moved huge amounts of cocaine and hashish, creating addiction and ruining lives all over North America. Their construction industry scams made costs higher and ruined public projects all over Quebec. Their money laundering helped organized crime all over the world. Their bribery of politicians broke down democratic systems. The violence, even though it did not happen as often as in earlier times, was just as nasty when it was used. By the late 1990s, Vito Rizzuto was probably the most powerful organized crime figure in Canada and one of the most important in North America. His organization's yearly income was guessed to be in the billions. His influence spread from Sicily to South America, and his nickname, Montreal's Teflon Don, borrowed from New York's John Gotti, showed how he seemed impossible for the police to catch. Law enforcement definitely knew about Vito and the Rizzuto organization. Police files had thousands of pages of surveillance reports, recordings of conversations, and reports from informants. But actually getting Vito convicted was nearly impossible. He protected himself with layers of people under him. He never directly took part in street-level crimes. He communicated in code or in person instead of on the phone. And he used smart ways to avoid being watched. Witnesses were too scared to testify. Evidence was never strong enough. And prosecutors found they could not build cases that would hold up in court. The empire seemed like it could not be touched. Vito's position seemed impossible to challenge. He had done what almost no organized crime figure ever does. He built a huge criminal business while staying free himself and looking respectable in public. To most people, he was a successful businessman, a family man with kids and grandkids, someone who gave money to good causes, a respected member of Montreal's Italian community. In private, he was something totally different. The head of a billion-dollar criminal organization responsible for countless ruined lives, murders, corruption, and human misery. The difference between how he looked in public and what he really was in private defined Vito Rizzuto. And for years, that difference was something he could keep going. But no empire lasts forever, and the past has a very long memory. January 20th, 2004 started as a normal winter morning in Montreal. Vito Rizzuto, now 57 years old, was at home in his Cartierville house when police officers knocked on his door. The arrest that followed would start the collapse of everything he had built over 30 years. Federal officers showed him an extradition warrant from the United States. Vito was charged with racketeering and planning murder, specifically the May 5, 1981, murders of the 3 Bonanno captains. The proof against him came from sources that no defense could fight. Joseph Massino himself. Massino, the same man who had ordered the 1981 hits and used Vito's help, had done something that was previously unthinkable. He had become a government informant. Facing life in prison and almost certain death, Massino chose to cooperate, becoming the first boss of a New York crime family to turn on his own people. His testimony gave prosecutors detailed, first-hand accounts of Bonanno family operations, including the 3 captains' murder and Vito's part in it. Also, Salvatore Vitali, Massino's brother-in-law and underboss, had also started working with the authorities. Many other Bonanno associates turned informant, creating a mountain of testimony about crimes from decades ago. The Code of Omerta, which Vito had lived by his whole life, was falling apart under the pressure of modern prosecutions and long prison sentences. For Vito, the arrest was both shocking and a huge strategic blow. He had known that the 1981 murders might come up again someday, but he had thought his protection was enough. He was a Canadian citizen, lived in Canada, and figured that even if American authorities found out he was involved, getting him sent to the U.S. would be hard or impossible. He was wrong. The legal fight to avoid extradition took 2 years. Vito's lawyers argued that the evidence was not strong enough, that too much time had passed, that Canadian law should not help American prosecutions for crimes that hold Canadian prosecutors. Under pressure from their American counterparts, and armed with Massino's testimony, argued that murder has no time limit and that working with other countries meant honoring legitimate extradition requests. During this time, Vito stayed in Canadian jail, unable to run business as usual, but still technically able to communicate with his organization. The uncertainty created immediate problems for the Rizzuto empire, with their leader possibly facing decades in an American prison. Different groups started positioning themselves to take advantage. Old enemies saw a chance. Allies started wondering if they should stay loyal to an organization whose future suddenly seemed very uncertain. In 2006, Canadian courts ruled against Vito. He was sent to the United States, taken to New York, and held while waiting for trial. The American justice system, much more aggressive in going after organized crime than its Canadian version, got ready to make an example of Montreal's Teflon Don. Vito's lawyers looked at the situation realistically, with Messino's testimony, with more proof from many other witnesses, with forensic analysis of the crime scene. Being found guilty seemed almost certain. A trial would be expensive, take a long time, and would probably end with a much harsher sentence than any plea deal. More importantly, a trial would show the full size of Vito's organization in open court, giving law enforcement information that could destroy his entire operation. In May 2007, Vito took a plea deal. He admitted he took part in the 1981 murders of Giaccone, Trinchera, and Indelicado. In exchange for this plea and his cooperation about that specific crime, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with credit for time he had already served. This meant he would probably get out around 2012. The sentence was both a win and a complete disaster. 10 years was way less than the life sentence a guilty verdict at trial could have given him. But 10 years was forever in the organized crime world. Vito would be in his mid-60s when he got out. If he survived American federal prison, his organization would be without real leadership for a whole decade. His enemies would have years to get ready to challenge his empire. His family would be vulnerable. Vito was sent to Florence, Colorado, to the Federal Correctional Institution there, a prison known for keeping high-profile criminals in very secure conditions. The prison, even though it was not the infamous ADX Supermax facility right next door, was still designed to keep dangerous inmates away from the outside world and from each other. Prison life was a huge change from the comfortable life Vito had known. He was far from Montreal, unable to go to family events, cut off from the criminal network he had spent decades building. Talking to the outside world was limited, watched closely, and dangerous. Anything he said could be recorded and used against him or his friends. The mental effect of prison on someone like Vito, a man who had huge power, who people respected and feared, who ran giant criminal businesses, is hard to describe. He was now just prisoner number 043, 07748, having to follow guards' orders, living on the prison schedule, stripped of the identity he had built over so many years. Even worse was coming, with Vito locked up in Colorado. Montreal's carefully built criminal balance fell apart. The unified system he had created, where arguments were settled, territories were respected, and violence was kept low, broke down as different groups moved in to grab pieces of the Rizzuto empire, leadership of the Rizzuto organization. On paper, fell to Vito's son, Nick Rizzuto Jr., and his father, Niccolo Rizzuto Sr., Nick Jr., in his early 40s, had been raised to eventually take over, but now he had to deal with responsibilities that were dumped on him way too early. Niccolo Sr., in his 80s, still had people's respect, but he did not have the energy or modern understanding needed to run a complicated criminal business. The real danger came from inside Vito's own organization. Reynold de Hardens, a longtime associate and trusted lieutenant, started making moves to grab power. De Hardens, a French speaker with his own criminal network, had been annoyed by Rizzuto control for years. With Vito in prison and the people who were supposed to take over seeming weak, de Hardens saw his chance. De Hardens formed an alliance with the old Calabrian groups who had hated Sicilian control since the 1980s. This coalition started systematically going after Rizzuto loyalists, using violence to scare and get rid of anyone who opposed them. The message was clear. The Rizzuto era was ending, and anyone who did not get on board with the new leadership would be taken out. December 28, 2009, was the first terrible blow to the Rizzuto family. Nick Rizzuto Jr., was driving near his father's construction company offices in Notre Dame de Grace, doing regular business in what should have been safe territory. Without warning, gunmen opened fire on his car. Nick Jr. was hit many times and died right there. He was 42 years old. The murder sent shockwaves through Montreal's underworld and showed that the Rizzutos could be hurt. The old mob rules said that family members, especially ones not directly involved in daily operations, were off limits. Killing Nick Jr. broke this rule, signaling that the war against the Rizzutos would be total. In Colorado, Vito got the news that his son had been murdered. The prison system let him watch the funeral through a video link, a surreal and painful experience. He could see his family mourning, see his son's coffin, see the community gathered to pay respects. But he could not be there, could not comfort his family, could not respond the way tradition and his position demanded. For a man who had built his reputation on power and control, this helplessness was agonizing. His son was dead. His family was under attack. His empire was falling apart, and he was locked in a Colorado prison cell, completely unable to do anything about it. The mental torture of this situation was probably worse than any physical punishment the American justice system could have given him. But the war was far from over. November 10th, 2010, was a normal evening in the Rizzuto household in Cartierville. Niccolo Rizzuto Sr., now 86 years old, was having dinner with his wife Libertina and other family members. The family home where Vito had grown up, where celebrations had been held, where the old Sicilian traditions were kept alive, should have been completely safe. Outside, a sniper got into position with a clear view through the dining room window. A single shot shattered the glass and hit Niccolo Sr., the patriarch of the Rizzuto family, the man who had come from Sicily in 1954, who had built the base of the empire, who had survived decades in the violent world of organized crime. He was killed instantly in his own home, in front of his wife of over 60 years. The murder was a message that was impossible to misunderstand. If the 86-year-old head of the family was not safe in his own house, then no one in the Rizzuto family was safe anywhere. The rules that had guided organized crime for generations, respect for the elderly, the safety of family homes, limits on who could be targeted, were all being broken on purpose to show that the Rizzuto organization was completely open to attack. In Colorado, Vito again got news of a family tragedy. He again watched a funeral over a video link. His father's funeral was attended by hundreds of people, legal business owners, politicians, obvious mobsters, and curious reporters. The send-off was fancy, respectful, and shown on TV all over the world, and Vito watched from a prison cell thousands of miles away, completely unable to do what he should as a son and as a Mafia boss. The message to the underworld was also very clear. Vito Rizzuto, the once untouchable Teflon Don, could not even protect his own family. His reputation, carefully built over decades, kept up by showing power and control, was being systematically destroyed while he sat in prison. Helpless, more murders followed. Paul Lorenda, Vito's brother-in-law and trusted advisor, was kidnapped in May 2010 and never seen again. Agostino Contrera, a key Rizzuto associate with connections to the Sicilian Mafia, was murdered. Many lower-level Rizzuto loyalists were killed or forced to run away from Montreal. The systematic destruction of the organization continued through 2010 and 2011. The Hardens and his Calabrian allies seemed to be winning. They controlled territory that the Rizzutos had once ruled. They had shown they could attack without being punished. And they had proven that even the most powerful crime boss could be made useless by being in prison. But they made a critical mistake. They celebrated too early. Vito Rizzuto was still alive, and his release date was getting closer. On October 5, 2012, after serving his time in American federal prison, Vito Rizzuto was released. He flew to Toronto, then immediately went to Montreal. The city he came back to was completely different from the one he had left. His son was dead. His father was dead. His brother-in-law was missing. His organization was broken apart. His enemies controlled territory he had once ruled, but Vito was free. The Montreal underworld braced itself for what would happen next. Everyone who had taken part in or supported the attacks on the Rizzuto family while Vito was in prison knew that payback was coming for sure. The only questions were when, how big, and if anyone could survive what was coming. Vito's first moves were, as always, patient and smart. He did not immediately start a wave of violence. Instead, he held quiet meetings with the loyal people he had left, figured out who had stayed faithful while he was in prison, and found out who had turned against the organization. He looked at the current criminal situation, understanding how power had shifted and where the weak spots were in his enemies' positions. Vito also got back in touch with his international allies. His relationships with New York families were still strong. They respected that he had stayed silent for a decade under pressure, that he had refused to cooperate with authorities, that he had kept omerta even though he had lost people he loved. His Sicilian connections were also still there. Most importantly, he had a lot of money hidden in legal businesses and accounts in other countries. Reports that his empire was dead were wrong. The criminal system Vito had built over decades was still partly working. Key people in port operations, construction companies, and money laundering networks had kept their jobs. Crooked officials who had been on the Rizzuto payroll were still willing to take bribes. The basic business operations, even though they had been messed up, could be started again with the right leadership. What Vito really needed was something more basic than business: revenge. In Sicilian culture, vendetta is not just about violence. It is about honor, family duty, and bringing balance back to a world that has been thrown into chaos by someone doing wrong. Every death in Vito's family created a debt that could only be paid with blood. His son's murder, his father's murder, his brother-in-law's disappearance. Each one demanded payback, not just for his own satisfaction, but to put back in place the basic rules that govern organized crime. If Vito did nothing, he would be finished. Every criminal in Montreal would know that the Rizzuto family could be attacked with no consequences. More challenges would definitely come. The family members he had left would still be in danger, and his organization would fall apart as people ran to join safer groups. But if Vito did something about it, and did it well, he would send a message that could not be ignored. The Rizzuto family was still powerful. Attacks on the family would be punished brutally, and the old order was being restored. The response, when it came, was systematic, professional, and devastating. From late 2012 and all through 2013, bodies started showing up all over Montreal. The pattern was clear to anyone who knew about organized crime. This was a systematic removal of enemies, done with the precision that had always marked Vito Rizzuto's operations. The first big target was Joe DiMaolo, a longtime Montreal mobster who had been a Rizzuto associate but had supposedly worked with the Dehardens group during the war. On November 8, 2012, just 1 month after Vito got out, DiMaolo was shot many times in the parking lot of a Blainville shopping center. The 70-year-old mobster died right there. The message was immediate. Working with the people who had attacked the Rizzuto family would not be forgiven. Gaetan Gosselin, a drug dealer connected to Dehardens, was murdered in January 2013. His body was found in a car in Terrebonne, shot execution style. Gosselin had been part of the group that challenged Rizzuto control, and his death showed that no one involved in the anti-Rizzuto movement was safe. Throughout 2013, more murders happened across Montreal and the surrounding areas. Some victims were obvious mobsters with clear connections to the groups against the Rizzutos. Others were less famous people. Enforcers, money launderers, drug distributors, whose deaths took away the ability of enemy organizations to operate. Each killing was professional, well planned, and left investigators scrambling for evidence that almost never showed up. This wave of violence had several effects on Montreal's underworld. First, it showed again that Vito was someone to be respected. His organization clearly still had the ability to find and kill enemies, even after years of being broken up. Second, it created terror among the people who had fought against the Rizzutos. No one knew if they were next on the list, which caused panic and people switching sides. Third, it told neutral groups and possible new allies that the Rizzuto organization was coming back strong, and that backing them was the best way to stay alive and make money. Reynold Dehardens, the main planner of the anti-Rizzuto campaign, went into hiding, eventually in 2013. He was arrested on other charges and put in prison, which took him out as an active threat, while Dehardens himself survived, protected somewhat by his high profile and police attention. His organization was taken apart. Many of his key associates were not so lucky. One of the most important targets was connected to Nick Rizzuto Jr. S. murder, Ducarme Joseph, leader of a Haitian street gang known as the 67s, was supposedly the driver of the getaway car used in Nick Jr. S. murder, even though Joseph survived at first, possibly because it was hard to be sure he was involved. His time would eventually run out. In August 2014, well after Vito's death, Joseph was shot many times at a strip club and killed. The Rizzuto organization's memory was long, and debts were paid even after the boss was gone. The violence was not random or mindless. It was carefully planned. Vito avoided making headlines by going after high-profile figures when it was not necessary, or by doing big public murders that would bring intense police pressure. The killings were professional, often happening in out-of-the-way places, and they were spaced out to avoid making it look like an all-out war that would force the police and government to step in hard. This restraint was a smart move. Vito understood that too much violence would make different groups join together against him and bring unwanted attention from the police. Instead, he went after specific people whose deaths would weaken enemy groups, while also showing how far his organization could reach and what it could do. It was violence as a way of communicating. Each murder sent messages about consequences, about power being restored, about order being put back in place. By the middle of 2013, the rebuilding was mostly done. The Dehardens group had fallen apart. Its leaders were dead, in prison, or had run away. The Calabrian groups that had challenged Sicilian control were wiped out or had asked for peace. Street gangs that had operated on their own while Vito was in prison were again paying money to the Rizzuto organization. The port, construction industry, and drug smuggling networks were again under one Rizzuto control. Montreal's underworld had gone back to the system Vito had set up before his arrest. United under one organization, arguments were settled instead of fought over. Violence was kept to a minimum, except when it was needed for discipline or growth. The message was impossible to miss. Vito Rizzuto was still Montreal's top crime boss, but the victory felt empty in ways that could not be measured. Vito had gotten his empire back, but his son was never coming back. He had avenged his father, but those years could never be gotten back. He had rebuilt his reputation, but the decade in prison had taken a toll on his body and his mind. He was 66 years old, dealing with health problems, and ruling over an empire that he had to rebuild through violence and blood. The question now was, how long could this last? Putting the Rizzuto organization back together after the devastating war required more than just getting rid of enemies. It meant rebuilding the systems, rebuilding trust, and dealing with the inevitable police attention that the violence had caused. Police all over Quebec and Canada had been documenting the murders, gathering information on the criminal landscape, and getting ready to file charges, even though individual killings stayed unsolved. Witnesses refused to talk, evidence was hard to find, and professional killers left almost no trace. Law enforcement understood the bigger picture. The Rizzuto organization was coming back strong, and its activities demanded a response. Also, the violence had gotten the attention of federal authorities, the RCMP, the SQ in Quebec, and various city police forces all worked together to target the Rizzuto organization. Wiretaps increased, surveillance got more intense, and prosecutors got ready to build complicated conspiracy cases that were designed to get around the usual problems of proving specific crimes. Vito, aware of this increased attention, operated with even more caution than before. He limited direct communication with the people under him, did business through trusted middlemen, and avoided any activity that could provide proof for a prosecution. His time in the American justice system had taught him the dangers of electronic communication, the value of keeping information in separate compartments, and the absolute need to keep himself separate from street-level criminal activity. The organization adapted. Leadership was set up in separate cells, with each unit operating somewhat on its own and communicating through safe channels. Money laundering became more advanced, using professional financial advisors and complicated international deals designed to hide where money came from. Drug operations kept a distance between bringing drugs in, distributing them, and selling them on the street, making sure that if one part was compromised, the others could keep working. Even with these precautions, the pressure was building. Several mid-level Rizzuto associates were arrested on different charges throughout 2013. Some faced drug charges, others money laundering accusations, and still others conspiracy charges related to specific murders. Even though none of these cases directly targeted Vito, prosecutors understood how hard it would be to prove he was involved. But the cases hurt his organization's ability to operate and created more legal danger. Financially, though, the organization stayed strong. Decades of successful operations had created enormous wealth, a lot of it invested in legal businesses or hidden in accounts in other countries. The construction company network, even though it was being investigated, kept operating and making both legal money and chances for fraud. Import-export businesses provided cover for smuggling. Real estate all over Montreal and internationally gave both income and ways to launder money. Vito's personal wealth was huge, though it was impossible to know exact numbers. Guesses put his fortune in the hundreds of millions. Even though much of this wealth was held through company structures, accounts in other countries, and things owned under associates' names, he lived comfortably, but not showing off, keeping the same quiet public image that had served him his whole career. The human cost, though, was beyond counting. The war that started while Vito was in prison and continued after he got back had killed dozens of people directly, mobsters, associates, and sometimes innocent people caught in the crossfire or mistaken for targets, indirectly. The Rizzuto organization's drug operations created addiction and ruined lives all over North America. The construction industry scams made costs higher for public projects, taking money away from good uses. The political bribery broke down democratic systems. The violence, even though it was used on purpose, traumatized families and communities. For Vito personally, the war had cost him his son and his father, losses that no amount of revenge could ever truly make up for. His relationship with his surviving son, Leonardo, was complicated by the younger man's understanding of the dangers that came with the family business. His grandchildren were growing up knowing their family name was tied to organized crime. His wife, Giovanna, had put up with decades of worry, loss, and the constant knowledge that her husband could be arrested, put in prison, or killed at any moment. The question Vito faced in late 2013 was about who would take over and what he would leave behind. He was 67 years old, his health was getting worse, and he knew his time was limited. Who would lead the organization after him? His son Leonardo did not have the desire or the toughness needed for the job. The associates he trusted were capable, but they did not have the family connections and reputation needed to command respect across the criminal world. The empire he had built over decades needed someone to take over, and there was no clear choice. This weakness, the lack of a clear plan for succession, created instability inside the organization and chances for rivals. Everyone in Montreal's underworld knew Vito would not live forever. His health was failing, and his empire would eventually be up for grabs. The only question was when. Throughout 2013, people close to Vito Rizzuto noticed changes. The man who had always been calm and in control seemed weighed down by something more than just the normal stress of running a criminal empire. His health was clearly getting worse. He looked thinner, moved more slowly, and sometimes seemed out of breath. The people close to him worried, but Vito kept his usual silence about personal things. The truth was that Vito had been diagnosed with lung cancer. The disease, possibly linked to smoking for decades, was aggressive. There were treatments available, but Vito was 67 years old, had gone through the stress of prison and the trauma of losing his son and father, and had spent months planning a violent campaign of revenge. His body was giving out. But Vito kept the diagnosis quiet for several reasons. First, looking weak in the organized crime world would bring challenges. Rivals would see an opportunity. Associates might leave, and the carefully rebuilt stability could fall apart. Second, he needed time to arrange who would take over and make sure his family was safe after he died. Third, his pride demanded that he face death the way he had lived, with dignity, control, and without showing weakness to outsiders. As his condition got worse, Vito worked to protect his family's position. He met with key associates, making sure they understood what was expected of them in terms of loyalty to his surviving family members. He reached out to New York families, asking them to keep respecting and protecting the Rizzuto organization after he was gone. He arranged financial matters, making sure his wife and grandchildren would be taken care of no matter what happened to the criminal business. He also met with his son Leonardo, in conversations that must have been hard for both of them. Leonardo had never fully accepted the criminal life that defined his father and brother. He had seen the costs: his brother's murder, his grandfather's murder, his father's time in prison, the constant violence and legal danger. Whether Leonardo could or would lead the organization after Vito's death was still unclear. December 2013 brought a fast decline in Vito's health. The lung cancer had spread, and problems like pneumonia and heart issues came up. On December 18th, Vito was admitted to Sacré-Cœur Hospital in Montreal. His condition was critical. For several days, he fought. His wife Giovanna stayed by his bed, along with other family members, the hospital, aware of who their patient was and the chance of violence, worked with police to make sure it was secure. Outside, reporters gathered, understanding that someone important in Montreal's history was dying. December 23, 2013, Vito Rizzuto died. The official cause was listed as problems from lung cancer and pneumonia. He was 67 years old, way longer than a lot of organized crime figures survive, but still a life cut short by the stress and results of the path he chose. The death of Montreal's Teflon Dome was international news. Media all over Canada, the United States, and Italy covered the story. Some described him as a criminal mastermind, others as a sign of how broken the system was, and still others as a leftover from a time when organized crime operated with almost no fear of getting caught. Everyone agreed that his death marked the end of an era in Canadian organized crime. December 30th, 2013, Montreal. The funeral of Vito Rizzuto was a show that showed the complicated layers of his life in the city he had ruled for decades. The service was held at the Chiesa della Madonna della Difesa, a beautiful Italian church in Montreal's Little Italy that had served the community for generations. The inside of the church, decorated with murals and religious art, was a strange setting for what was basically a gathering of criminals, corrupt officials, and curious reporters. Hundreds of people came. The crowd included obvious mobsters, men in expensive suits with suspicious bulges under their jackets, giving each other wary looks and looking at the police photographers who were documenting who attended. There were legal business people who had dealt with Rizzuto-connected construction companies or other businesses, keeping carefully neutral expressions while paying their respects. Politicians came, some quietly, some more openly, a reminder of the political connections that had protected the Rizzuto organization for years. Outside, police from many agencies watched. Officers took pictures of everyone going in and out, wrote down license plates, and gathered information on who came and who stayed away. The funeral was an amazing chance to map out Montreal's criminal world. Seeing who paid their respects showed alliances and loyalties that might not otherwise be visible. Media coverage was everywhere. TV cameras broadcast from across the street. Reporters talked to local people about Vito's legacy. And analysts talked about what his death meant for organized crime in Montreal and Canada. The coverage went between respectful talk about his influence and critical looks at his criminal career. The funeral itself was traditional Italian Catholic, prayers, hymns, a eulogy, communion. The priest who led it certainly knew Vito's history, but kept the church's role of offering spiritual comfort. No matter what sins someone committed in life, in Catholic tradition, even the worst sinner deserves a proper funeral and prayers for their soul. Giovanna Rizzuto, Vito's widow, was supported by family members through the whole service. Their grief was real. Whatever Vito had been to the world, to them he was a husband, father, grandfather. The family's loss was real. Even if the dead man had caused huge losses to others, the burial followed at a private cemetery with fewer people there, but no less security. As Vito's coffin was lowered into the ground, the people there understood they were watching the end of something important. The man who had ruled Montreal's criminal underworld for 30 years, who had survived prison and planned a brutal revenge, who had built and rebuilt a criminal empire, was gone. But what would happen next? In the weeks and months after Vito's death, the Rizzuto organization faced the problem of who would take over. Just as he had feared, Leonardo Rizzuto, took over as the leader in name. But he did not have his father's reputation, connections, or ruthless decision-making. Other family members and longtime associates jostled for position, each one claiming to represent the true continuation of Vito's legacy. The falling apart that resulted was predictable. Without Vito's presence to hold everyone together, the group of criminal organizations he had put together started breaking up. Street gangs started doing their own thing again. Rival Italian groups challenged Rizzuto control, and various ethnic criminal organizations operated without any coordination or oversight. Law enforcement, seeing a chance in this chaos, increased their efforts against the remaining Rizzuto loyalists. In 2015, Leonardo Rizzuto and several associates were arrested on drug charges. The evidence against them included recordings of conversations, surveillance documentation, and testimony from witnesses who decided to cooperate, building a case that would have been impossible to make against Vito at his peak. More arrests followed through 2015 and 2016. The RCMP and provincial police did coordinated raids all over Montreal, seizing drugs, weapons, cash, and documents. Dozens of people connected to the Rizzuto organization were charged with different crimes: drug trafficking, weapons possession, conspiracy, money laundering. The construction industry corruption that had funded much of the Rizzuto empire became the subject of a big provincial investigation. The Charbonneau Commission, set up to look into corruption in Quebec's construction industry, heard testimony about bid rigging, contract fraud, political bribery, and organized crime getting into the business. Even though the commission focused on system-wide problems instead of specific prosecutions, its findings showed how much the Rizzuto organization had corrupted legal industries. By 2016, the Rizzuto organization, as Vito had structured it, was effectively destroyed. Family members were in prison. Key associates had been arrested or killed. Financial networks were broken, and law enforcement had successfully broken the organization's hold on Montreal's criminal economy. Other groups filled the gap. Motorcycle gangs, especially the Hells Angels, grew their operations. Street gangs operated more openly without Rizzuto oversight. The old Calabrian groups tried to take back territory they had lost decades earlier. The result was more violence, less coordination, and a more chaotic criminal world than when Vito was in charge. Ironically, some law enforcement officials privately admitted that the Rizzuto organization's collapse had negative results. While Vito had definitely been a criminal, his control over Montreal's underworld had reduced violence and given them one organization they could focus on. The broken-up world that followed his death was in some ways harder to police, more violent and more chaotic. Looking at Vito Rizzuto's legacy means dealing with deep contradictions. He was at the same time a devoted family man and a murderer, a successful businessman and a drug dealer, a community figure and someone who corrupted democratic systems. Understanding his impact requires looking past simple labels. From a criminal point of view, Vito's achievements were amazing. He turned a local organized crime operation into an international empire, united different criminal groups under one leader, kept this control for decades while avoiding prosecution, and built wealth that was guessed to be in the hundreds of millions. His skill at negotiating reduced violence compared to other criminal markets. His business sense created huge profits, and his silence protected the organization from law enforcement for years. He adapted old Sicilian Mafia traditions to a modern Canadian setting, proving that the ancient code of omerta could work in a multicultural democracy. He built bridges between different criminal groups, Italians, French Canadians, Haitians, motorcycle gangs, creating a coordinated structure that increased profits while reducing conflict. His intelligence and strategic thinking put him above typical organized crime figures. But this criminal success came at an enormous human cost. The Rizzuto organization's drug operations moved cocaine and heroin across North America, creating addiction, destroying families, and adding to social problems in countless communities. The violence, even though it happened less often than in some criminal markets, was still brutal when it was used. Dozens of murders can be blamed, directly or indirectly, on Rizzuto operations. The construction industry corruption made costs higher for public projects all over Quebec, basically stealing from taxpayers while breaking down democratic systems. The political bribery hurt how elections worked and how policies were made. The money laundering helped international criminal enterprises beyond just Vito's own operations. The overall effect on Canadian society was deeply negative. Personally, Vito paid a huge price for his criminal success. He spent years in an American federal prison, cut off from his family and unable to do business. His son was murdered, his father murdered, his brother-in-law disappeared, all results of the violent world he chose to live in. His last years were spent planning revenge and fighting a deadly illness, dying at 67 when he might have lived longer if he had chosen a different path. His family also paid a heavy price. Giovanna went through decades of worry, loss, and being tied to organized crime. Leonardo and Vito's other surviving family members lived under constant watch. Their chances in life were limited by their family name, and their safety was never guaranteed. The grandchildren grew up knowing their background included both normal success and criminal violence. The wider Italian-Canadian community had complicated feelings about Vito. Some saw him with pride, a Sicilian immigrant who gained wealth and power in his new country, who supported community causes and kept cultural traditions alive. Others resented the connection between Italian ethnicity and organized crime, feeling that Vito made harmful stereotypes worse that affected all Italian Canadians, no matter what their actual connection was to criminal activity. For Montreal, Vito's legacy includes both the criminal empire he built and the corruption he showed existed. The Charbonneau Commission's findings about construction industry corruption shocked many Quebecers, showing how much organized crime had gotten into legal systems. The changes that came after, even though they were not complete, were attempts to deal with system-wide problems that the Rizzuto organization had used for decades. Culturally, Vito's story has been told in books, documentaries, and countless news articles. Business or Blood by Antonio Nicasso and Lai Lameth gave the full story of his life. Mafia, Inc. by Andre Sedelat and Andre Newell looked at the bigger Rizzuto organization. These works, even though they were well researched, also helped make organized crime seem a little romantic, presenting Vito as a fascinating person, while sometimes not fully showing the human cost of his activities. The comparison to John Gotti, shown in Vito's nickname, Montreal's Teflon Don, is telling. Both men led powerful criminal organizations, kept up public images while doing illegal business, and avoided prosecution for years. But their styles were completely different. Gotti was flashy, seeking media attention and building a celebrity image. Vito was quiet, avoiding attention and keeping a low profile. In the end, both men died having seen their empires fall apart, Gotti in prison, Vito barely a year after rebuilding what he had lost. What Vito Rizzuto's story shows about broader themes in organized crime in modern times, his rise, rule, And fall happened during a time of huge change in how criminal organizations worked and how law enforcement responded. The traditional Italian-American mafia model, which Vito adapted to Canadian conditions, was in decline his whole life. The five families of New York, once seeming impossible to touch, faced devastating prosecutions under RICO laws. Bosses who had once commanded total loyalty became government witnesses, breaking the code of omerta that had protected organized crime for generations. Joseph Messino's cooperation, the very testimony that eventually put Vito in prison, was a huge moment. When the boss of a New York crime family became a government informant, it showed that the old codes could not hold up under modern prosecutorial pressure. Life sentences, RICO conspiracy charges, and having assets taken away created reasons to cooperate that earlier generations would have found unthinkable. Vito, to his credit, never broke omerta. Even after years in prison, even after devastating personal losses, even with chances to reduce his sentence by cooperating, he stayed silent about his organization's operations and associates. This old-school loyalty to the code earned him respect in the criminal world. But it also meant he served his full sentence and that he faced enemy violence when he got out. With no protection from law enforcement, technology changed both organized crime and law enforcement during Vito's career. Early in his criminal life, police surveillance meant watching in person, which was expensive, took a lot of time, and was easy to spot. By the 2000s, wiretaps could listen to thousands of conversations. GPS tracking showed where people went. Financial analysis software could find money laundering. And digital forensics could recover messages that people thought were deleted. Vito adapted by avoiding electronic communication, doing business face-to-face, and keeping a gap between himself and street-level operations. But this adaptation had limits. Modern RICO-style conspiracy prosecutions did not need proof of direct involvement in specific crimes. Just showing that someone led an organization that did criminal activity could be enough for a conviction. The very structure that protected Vito from direct prosecution also became proof that he was the leader. The drug trade, which provided the money foundation for Vito's empire, also changed during his lifetime. In the 1970s and early 1980s, heroin was the main illegal drug market. By the 1990s and 2000s, cocaine became the biggest thing, while methamphetamine and synthetic drugs created new markets. The Rizzuto organization adapted to these changes, keeping relationships with suppliers who could provide whatever products made the most money. But this drug trafficking created results that went way beyond the organization's bank accounts. The cocaine epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s, the crack cocaine crisis that destroyed city neighborhoods, the ongoing opioid epidemic that has killed hundreds of thousands, all were made easier by trafficking networks like the ones the Rizzuto organization ran. The human cost, even though it was far from the boardrooms where traffickers made their decisions, was still real and devastating. Money laundering evolved from simple cash-based operations to advanced financial engineering. Early in Vito's career, laundering drug money meant pushing cash through legal businesses. Restaurants, construction companies, retail stores that could plausibly take in a lot of cash. By the 2000s, money laundering used offshore financial centers, shell companies, complicated deals designed to hide where money came from, and professional financial advisors who specialized in avoiding detection. The Rizzuto organization's money laundering operations became more and more advanced, using Canadian banks, Caribbean financial centers, and European institutions. These operations did not just serve the Rizzuto organization. They provided services to other criminal enterprises. making fees while building relationships with international criminals. The size was huge, with billions of dollars moving through laundering networks over decades. Political corruption, even though it was not unique to the Rizzuto organization, reached levels in Quebec that shocked Canadians when it was finally exposed. The Charbonneau Commission heard testimony about systematic corruption in construction bidding, political campaign money coming from illegal donations, and organized crime getting into democratic institutions. While not all this corruption was directly connected to the Rizzuto organization, Vito's empire certainly took part in and benefited from the system. This corruption had real results for Quebec society. Infrastructure projects cost more than they should have, making criminals and crooked officials richer while giving fewer public benefits. Political decisions were influenced by illegal money instead of the public good. Trust in democratic institutions went down as citizens learned how much corruption there was. The Rizzuto organization's part in this system added to wider social harm beyond just their direct criminal activities. Beyond the numbers, the prosecution records, and the media coverage, there are individual human stories. People whose lives crossed paths with Vito Rizzuto and his organization, often with tragic results. Think about the victims of violence that can be directly blamed on Rizzuto operations. The 3 captains murdered in 1981, Philip Giacconi, Dominic Trinchera, and Alphonse Indelicato, had families who mourned their loss, no matter what their criminal activities were. They had kids who grew up without fathers, wives who became widows, parents who buried sons. The violence that helped Vito's career created human suffering that went way beyond the people who were killed. Nick Rizzuto Jr. His murder in 2009 destroyed his family. He was a father, a husband, a son, someone loved by people who experienced his death as a personal tragedy. No matter what his criminal ties were, his kids grew up without their father. His wife became a widow at a young age, and his family went through loss made worse by the public nature of his murder and the situation around it. Niccolo Rizzuto Sr.'s murder, killed in his own home at age 86 while having dinner with his wife, was a special kind of cruelty. Libertina Rizzuto saw her husband murdered, going through trauma that no later justice could erase. She lost her partner of over 60 years in an instant of violence, showing that even in the criminal underworld, where violence is expected, some acts create wounds that never heal. The unknown victims of drug operations are probably the biggest human cost. People who became addicted to cocaine or heroin that was trafficked by the Rizzuto organization. Families destroyed by addiction. Communities made unstable by drug-related violence and social problems. These results are hard to count, but are no less real. Every kilogram of cocaine that moved through Rizzuto networks possibly destroyed many lives through addiction and all the problems that come with it. There were also people who worked for the organization in small jobs. Bookkeepers, drivers, low-level dealers, who faced prosecution and prison for being involved. Many of these people were not violent criminals. They were just people who made bad choices, took criminal jobs for money reasons, or just found themselves in situations where saying no to the Rizzuto organization seemed impossible. Their lives were also damaged by being part of the criminal enterprise. Law enforcement people who spent their careers investigating and prosecuting the Rizzuto organization also paid a personal cost. Police officers and investigators spent years, sometimes decades, building cases while facing danger from criminals who did not hesitate to use violence against people who threatened their operations. Prosecutors faced professional and personal risks going after organized crime cases. These people gave up personal time, safety, and sometimes family relationships to try to get justice. The Italian-Canadian community in Montreal had complicated feelings about Vito and his organization. On one hand, some community members felt pride in a Sicilian immigrant who gained wealth and power, who kept cultural traditions alive, who supported community causes. On the other hand, many people resented the connection between Italian ethnicity and organized crime, knowing that Vito's criminal empire made stereotypes worse that affected all Italian Canadians. Community leaders worked for decades to fight these stereotypes, saying that most Italian Canadians were law-abiding citizens with no connection to organized crime. But because the Rizzuto organization was so famous, and media coverage often mixed up Italian ethnicity with Mafia activity, this job was harder. Young Italian Canadians faced ideas about criminal connections. People with Italian names applying for jobs sometimes faced discrimination, and the community's reputation suffered because of a criminal minority's activities. Giovanna Rizzuto's story deserves special attention. She married Vito in 1966 when both were young, probably knowing about his family's criminal connections, but maybe not fully understanding what that would mean for their lives. In almost 50 years of marriage, she went through her husband's time in prison, her son's murder, her father-in-law's murder, constant law enforcement attention, media scrutiny, and the knowledge that her husband was responsible for unimaginable suffering through his criminal activities. Yet she stayed loyal, going to his prison, watching funerals over video link, supporting him after he got out, staying by his bed as he died. Her loyalty could be seen as agreeing with his crimes, as a woman who chose to benefit from criminal money while ignoring the results. Or it could be understood as a woman trapped by circumstances, cultural expectations, and family loyalty in a situation that seemed impossible to escape. The truth is probably somewhere in between these ideas. The children and grandchildren who survived him were left with complicated legacies. They carry a name tied to organized crime, face constant questions about their own possible criminal involvement, and live knowing their family history includes both normal success and brutal violence. Some tried to get away from the family business, going for legal careers and avoiding criminal ties. Others ended up getting pulled into the underworld, whether by choice, family pressure, or just the real fact that criminal connections offered chances they could not get anywhere else. Vito Rizzuto's story offers lessons about organized crime, law enforcement, society, and human nature. Even though getting clear moral guidance from such a morally complicated story is hard. First, it shows that organized crime succeeds not mostly through violence, but through intelligence, strategic thinking, and corruption of legal systems. Vito's greatest strength was not that he was willing to order murders. A lot of criminals have that kind of ruthlessness. It was his ability to build relationships, negotiate agreements, and create organizational structures that made the most money while taking the least risk. He understood that a criminal business that lasts needs more than just muscle. It needs business sense, diplomatic skills, and strategic patience. This reality is a challenge for law enforcement and society. If organized crime was mostly about violence, police could just respond with force and by prosecuting violent criminals. But when organized crime works through corruption, getting into legal businesses and advanced financial operations, the old ways of law enforcement are not enough. Fighting organized crime needs efforts against corruption, financial rules, and changes to systems that go way beyond just arresting individual criminals. Second, Vito's story shows the limits of criminal organizations based on old codes in the modern legal world. The Sicilian Code of Omerta, which Vito lived by his whole life. Worked well when law enforcement was weak, when the tools prosecutors had were limited, and when criminal organizations could force people to follow the rules with violence and threats. But modern RICO laws, witness protection programs, and minimum sentences have created reasons for people to cooperate that break down the old codes. Joseph Massino's choice to become a government informant, which ended up putting Vito in prison, showed that even the most respected mob bosses will break omerta when they are under enough pressure. The code that once seemed unbreakable has shown it can be broken by modern prosecutorial tactics. Vito's loyalty to omerta earned him respect, but it also made sure he stayed in prison and helped cause his empire to be weak while he was locked up. Third, the story shows the results of criminal success that cannot be avoided. Vito gained wealth, power, and respect in the world he chose. But these achievements came with costs that ended up destroying him. He spent years in prison, lost his son and father to violence, watched his empire almost collapse, and died fighting a deadly illness while trying to protect his family's future. The temporary wins of a criminal business always end in prison. Violence or death. There are no happy endings in organized crime, just different levels of tragic endings. This reality is a challenge to the romanticized images of organized crime in popular culture. Movies and TV shows often show gangsters as glamorous anti-heroes, focusing on their charisma, power, and fancy lifestyles, while downplaying the results. Vito's real story, with its years in prison, family members murdered, always looking over his shoulder, and finally dying while his empire fell apart, shows a much less appealing reality. The truth of organized crime is darker, more tragic, and less glamorous than what Hollywood shows. Fourth, Vito's career shows how organized crime changes to fit new situations. He successfully moved from heroin to cocaine trafficking, from simple money laundering to advanced financial operations, from local control to international networks, and from traditional Sicilian structures to multicultural criminal coalitions. This ability to change let his organization survive and do well through decades of change. But this ability to change has troubling results for law enforcement and society. Every time authorities develop new tools or plans to fight organized crime, criminal organizations adapt, finding new methods, new markets, and new structures. The Rizzuto organization's change from traditional Mafia operations to a modern international business shows this pattern. Fighting organized crime effectively needs constant change from law enforcement and society, understanding that criminals will always try to use new chances and get around new rules. Fifth, the story shows the complicated connection between organized crime and ethnic communities. The Rizzuto organization came out of Montreal's Italian immigrant community, used ethnic networks to find new members and get support, and claimed to represent community interests. But the organization's criminal activities ended up hurting the wider Italian-Canadian community by making stereotypes worse, bringing law enforcement attention, and connecting Italian ethnicity with criminal behavior. This pattern is not just for Italian organized crime. Similar things happen with other ethnic criminal groups. Understanding this means realizing that even though organized crime often uses ethnic connections, most community members are law-abiding citizens who hate the criminal minorities that hurt their community's reputation. Fighting organized crime must avoid racial profiling while still understanding that some criminal organizations do use ethnic networks. Sixth, Vito's story shows the corrupting effect of criminal money on legal systems. The Rizzuto organizations getting into Quebec's construction industry, their bribery of political processes, their relationships with banks and financial companies. All show how criminal profits can break down democratic society. This corruption goes beyond just direct bribery to include the quiet influence that huge amounts of money give in capitalist societies. Dealing with this corruption needs more than just prosecuting individual criminals. It needs changes to systems that reduce chances for corruption, clear rules for political money that limit illegal influence, financial rules that find and stop money laundering, and cultural changes that resist the idea that criminal wealth is normal. Quebec's Charbonneau Commission was a step in this direction, even though actually making meaningful changes turned out to be politically hard. Standing back from all the details of Vito Rizzuto's life, some bigger ideas come out about his importance and legacy. Vito was the last generation of old-school organized crime bosses who could build and keep traditional criminal empires. The mix of things that helped him succeed: relatively weak law enforcement tools, limited international cooperation, corrupt political environments, traditional code-based criminal organizations, has mostly disappeared, modern prosecutorial techniques, better international law enforcement teamwork, and the breakdown of omerta have made it much harder for individuals to build and keep the kind of empire Vito controlled. The breaking apart of Montreal's underworld after his death shows this reality. No single person or organization has been able to copy the unified control Vito had. Instead, many smaller groups operate in a more chaotic, violent, and less coordinated criminal world. This is not because no criminals have Vito's intelligence or ambition, but because the conditions that helped him rise no longer exist. From a law enforcement view, Vito's career shows both successes and failures. Authorities eventually put him in prison and took apart his organization, which were big wins. But this success only came after decades when Vito operated with almost no fear, making billions in criminal profits and causing huge social harm. The time between crimes and results, shown by the 23-year gap between the 1981 murders and his 2004 arrest, suggests that law enforcement tools and plans, even though they eventually worked, are still not good enough to stop things quickly. The American prosecution that eventually put Vito in prison succeeded where Canadian authorities had failed for decades. This difference raises questions about the differences between American and Canadian legal systems, the resources prosecutors have, and the political will to fight organized crime. It also shows how important international cooperation is. Vito's Canadian base gave him some protection from American law enforcement, but in the end, international extradition treaties let authorities prosecute crimes committed on U.S. soil. Economically, Vito's organization shows how profitable organized crime can be and the problems this creates for society. His empire made billions in money, giving him resources for advanced operations, bribes, legal defense, and violent enforcement. Legal businesses have trouble competing with criminal enterprises that do not pay taxes, ignore rules, and use violence to get rid of competition. The economic problems caused by organized crime go way beyond just direct criminal activities. Socially, Vito's legacy includes his part in drug addiction, political corruption, damage to institutions, and social problems in many communities and countries. Even though it is hard to count these harms, how many lives were destroyed by drugs his organization trafficked? How much public money was stolen through construction corruption? How much social trust was worn away by political bribery? The total effect was definitely huge and negative. The human cost talked about earlier needs to be repeated. Behind the numbers and prosecution records are countless individual tragedies. Murder victims, people hurt by drug addiction, families destroyed, communities damaged. Vito's criminal success was built on a foundation of human suffering, a reality that is sometimes hidden when people focus on his intelligence, strategic skill, and organizational achievements. But Vito was also undeniably smart, strategically brilliant, and organizationally talented. If he had used these abilities for legal businesses, he might have gained similar wealth and success without causing the suffering his criminal career created. This raises uncomfortable questions about human potential and moral choice. How many smart, capable people choose criminal paths when legal chances might work just as well for them? What social conditions, cultural factors, or individual personalities lead talented people toward destructive instead of constructive uses of their abilities? These questions do not have simple answers. Vito was born into a family already connected to organized crime, grew up in a place where criminal activity was normal, and got an education in illegal businesses from childhood. His choices were limited by his situation, even though he still had moral choice and was responsible for his decisions. Understanding his path means understanding both the structural factors that shaped his chances and the individual choices that decided where he ended up. The Montreal that exists years after Vito Rizzuto's death is very different from the city he ruled. The criminal world has broken apart. Law enforcement has had big wins against the remaining organized crime elements, and changes to systems have reduced some chances for corruption. But organized crime has not disappeared. It has just changed to fit new situations. The Rizzuto family name still means something in Montreal's underworld, even though the organization that Vito built no longer exists in its old form. Some family members are still involved in criminal activities. Others have tried to get away from that legacy, and still others are in prison for different crimes. Leonardo Rizzuto, Vito's surviving son, faced legal problems, including drug charges, even though he has kept a much lower profile than his father ever did. Different criminal groups now compete for control of drug trafficking, organized theft, fraud operations, and other illegal businesses. Motorcycle gangs, especially the Hells Angels, have grown their operations. Street gangs operate more on their own than they could under Rizzuto control. Ethnic criminal organizations from different communities do their own specialized criminal activities. The result is a more broken up, competitive, and violent criminal world than existed under Vito's unified control. This breaking apart has created both chances and problems for law enforcement. On one hand, going after many smaller organizations is in some ways easier than fighting a unified empire with advanced ways to avoid surveillance and lots of legal money. On the other hand, the growth of criminal groups, more violence, and always changing alliances create their own problems for investigation and prosecution. Port security has gotten somewhat better with more screening, better oversight, and less corruption, making large-scale drug smuggling harder. But determined criminals keep finding ways to bring in illegal drugs, using creative hiding methods, bribing individual officials, or just accepting higher costs and risks as part of doing business. The basic fact that huge profits from drug trafficking make people keep trying to get around barriers has not changed. Construction industry reforms that came after the Charbonneau Commission have reduced some chances for corruption and organized crime getting into the business. Bidding processes now have more oversight, political money faces more scrutiny, and criminal involvement has become riskier. But the construction industry is still open to corruption, and determined criminals keep finding ways to profit from public projects. The Italian-Canadian community is still dealing with the legacy of the Rizzuto organization and how it affected the community's reputation. Community leaders talk about how most Italian Canadians are law-abiding, about the community's contributions to Montreal society, and about how unfair it is to connect an entire ethnic group with a criminal minority. Younger generations increasingly think of themselves as Canadian instead of specifically Italian, which makes ethnic identity less important while possibly weakening cultural connections. Montreal's wider society has become more aware of organized crime's impact through all the media coverage of the Rizzuto organization, the Charbonneau Commission's revelations, and ongoing criminal prosecutions. This awareness has created public pressure for change, even though turning awareness into effective policy changes is hard. Political corruption, even though it has been reduced some, has not been eliminated. Organized crime, even though it has been broken up, is still operating. The basic problems are still there, even as specific organizations rise and fall. Putting Vito Rizzuto in the wider history of organized crime shows both what made him special and what was normal about him. He shares traits with other famous organized crime figures, while also having unique features that set him apart. Compared to American Mafia bosses of his time, Vito operated with more quiet and sophistication. John Gotti, whose nickname Vito borrowed, was flashy, looked for media attention, and ended up getting prosecuted, partly because he was so famous. Carlo Gambino, an earlier New York boss, was more like Vito's approach, keeping a low profile, operating through middlemen, and avoiding law enforcement attention. Vito's success in keeping control while avoiding prosecution for decades suggests he learned lessons from both successful and unsuccessful American bosses. Compared to Mexican or Colombian drug cartel leaders, Vito operated in a very different world. Latin American cartels faced less effective law enforcement, controlled territory with military-style violence, and operated in countries where government power was weaker or more corrupt. Vito's Canadian base had rule of law, effective, if not always honest institutions, and social stability that needed a different way of operating. His diplomatic, businesslike style showed he was adapting to a democratic developed nation instead of a weak or failing state. Compared to Asian organized crime groups like triads or Yakuza, Vito's organization was culturally specific to Italian Sicilian traditions, but worked in similar ways. Like successful Asian criminal enterprises, the Rizzuto organization used ethnic networks, kept international connections, had different kinds of businesses, and balanced violence with business sense, the universal rules of successful organized crime: building relationships, bribing officials, having different ways to make money, keeping discipline, go beyond specific cultural backgrounds. Compared to modern international criminal organizations, Vito's empire was both ahead of its time and eventually outdated. His international drug smuggling networks, advanced money laundering, and coordination across borders predicted modern transnational crime. But his organization's structure with a clear hierarchy, reliance on old codes, and ethnic sameness were older models that modern criminal networks have grown past. Modern international organized crime more and more works through loose networks instead of strict hierarchies, uses technology to talk and coordinate, and gets members from different backgrounds instead of specific ethnic groups. These structural changes are a response to the same law enforcement pressures that eventually broke apart the Rizzuto organization, suggesting that criminal businesses keep changing to survive in increasingly hostile legal environments. More than 10 years after his death, Vito Rizzuto's shadow still falls over Montreal. His name is still connected to organized crime in Canada. His career is a case study in criminal business, and his story still fascinates people interested in true crime. The places connected to him, his Cartierville home, the coffee shops where he did business, the cemetery where he is buried, have become landmarks in Montreal's criminal geography. Books have been written, documentaries made, and countless articles published about Vito and his organization. Antonio Nicasso's Business or Blood is still the main book about his life, while other works look at specific parts of his career or put him in wider organized crime contexts. This continued attention shows both real historical interest and a troubling romanticizing of criminal life. The line between documenting history and making crime look glamorous is sometimes hard to see. Vito's intelligence, strategic skill, and success in building a criminal empire make a good story. But this story risks hiding the human cost, the addiction, violence, corruption, and suffering that his organization created. Responsible coverage must show both his undeniable abilities and the devastating results of how he used them. For law enforcement, the Rizzuto case provides lessons about investigating and prosecuting organized crime. The eventual success in putting Vito in prison and taking apart his organization shows that patient, advanced investigation can beat even very sophisticated criminal enterprises. But the decades when Vito operated with almost no fear also show the limits of law enforcement resources, the challenges of international cooperation, and the difficulties of prosecuting smart criminals who protect themselves behind layers of organization. For society, Vito's story raises basic questions about what conditions let organized crime grow. Drug prohibition creates black markets that make huge criminal profits. Political corruption creates chances for criminal influence. Economic inequality creates pools of people who might join criminal organizations. Ethnic discrimination can push communities toward being closed off, which helps criminal activity. Fighting organized crime means looking at these bigger social conditions, not just prosecuting individual criminals. The tragedy of Vito Rizzuto's life is not that he ended up in prison and dead. Results he definitely earned through his crimes, but the waste of human potential. A man of obvious intelligence, strategic brilliance, and organizational talent chose to use these abilities for criminal enterprise, creating huge suffering to get wealth and power. You cannot help wondering what he might have done if he had chosen different paths, but that kind of thinking is useless. Vito made his choices, lived by them, and died with them. His empire has fallen apart. His family has scattered or been put in prison, and his name has become connected to the criminal underworld he ruled. This is his legacy, not the wealth he gathered or the power he held, but the suffering he caused and the eventual collapse of everything he built. The nickname Teflon Don suggested that nothing stuck to Vito Rizzuto. The charges, investigations, and attempts to prosecute him slid off like water off a Teflon coating. For decades, this nickname seemed right. He avoided prosecution, built his empire, and seemed untouchable. But in the end, the Teflon failed. The past caught up, the evidence piled up, and the prosecution worked. He spent years in prison, lost his son and father, and died knowing his empire was falling apart. The idea that he could not be touched collapsed, showing the basic truth that all criminal empires eventually face. Nothing lasts forever. In the end, Vito Rizzuto was not a romantic anti-hero or a simple bad guy, not a criminal genius or just a lucky gangster. He was a complicated human being who made choices with devastating results for himself, his family, and countless others whose lives crossed paths with his criminal business. His story is one of intelligence used for the wrong things, abilities pointed in the wrong direction, and temporary wins that led to final defeat. It is a story with no good guys, where everyone pays a price and no one really wins. It is the story of the last great Canadian Godfather, a man who rose from Sicilian poverty to rule a major North American city, only to watch everything fall apart in blood and betrayal. This is not a story to be celebrated, but it should not be forgotten either. Vito Rizzuto's life and career show important truths about organized crime, about human nature, about society's weak points and law enforcement's challenges. Understanding his story in all its complexity, tragedy, and darkness gives insight into the ongoing fight between criminal business and social order, between individual ambition and the good of everyone, between the temptations of illegal wealth and the costs that such wealth always demands. In the frozen ground of a Montreal cemetery, Vito Rizzuto rests beside his murdered son and murdered father. 3 generations of the Rizzuto family, together in death as they were in life, connected by blood, loyalty, and the violent world they chose to live in. Their graves stand as monuments, not to criminal success, but to the unavoidable results of lives lived outside the law. The empire has fallen. The Teflon Don is dead. Montreal continues its complicated relationship with the legacy of the man who ruled its underworld for 30 years. Remembering, analyzing, and hopefully learning from a story that should be a warning instead of an inspiration. If you are still here, if you have stayed with me through every part of this story, through Vito's rise in Montreal's underworld, through the bloody night at the Brooklyn Social Club, through his decade in prison, through the murders of his son and father, through his calculated revenge, and finally through his death, then you understand something that most people never will. You understand that the real story of organized crime is not what Hollywood shows you. It is not glamorous. It is not exciting. It is a slow-burning tragedy where everyone loses in the end. Vito built an empire that took 30 years to build and less than 5 to destroy. He gathered wealth beyond imagination, but could not spend a single dollar to save his son's life. He commanded respect from criminals on 2 continents, but died knowing his dynasty was falling apart. He lived by a code of honor that could not protect him from the one thing no code can protect against: the passing of time and the certainty of consequences. Think about that for a moment. The man who seemed untouchable for decades, who earned the nickname Teflon Don because nothing stuck to him, ended up losing everything that mattered. His son murdered in broad daylight. His father shot through a window while eating dinner. His empire torn apart by men he had trusted. His freedom taken away by testimony from the very people he had helped decades earlier. His life cut short by disease while everything he built turned to dust. And if you want more stories like this, more deep dives into the criminals, crime families, and true stories that shaped history, then subscribe. Because your subscription is what makes it possible to keep doing this work. Turn on notifications too, because when I drop the next story, and trust me, there are more amazing true crime sagas coming, you will want to know. These are not the stories you have heard 1,000 times. These are the deep cuts, the complete pictures, the ones that take 3 hours to tell properly, because anything less would not do them justice. Drop a comment and tell me what you thought. Did Vito deserve what happened to him? Was his revenge justified, or did it just keep an endless cycle of violence going? Could he have walked away at any point, or was he trapped by circumstances and choices that made escape impossible? I read every comment, and I am genuinely curious what you think now that you know the whole story. And share this. Send it to that friend who loves true crime. Share it with anyone who thinks they know about the Mafia, but has never heard of Montreal's Teflon Don. Post it wherever you want, because stories like this thoroughly researched, carefully told, refusing to make things look glamorous, while also refusing to make things too simple. These stories deserve to be heard. This is the story of Vito Rizzuto, complete in all its tragic complexity. Until the next story, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember, every empire falls eventually. Like, subscribe, comment, share. Let us keep telling the stories that matter.